something like that. For that was his point in describing Luke as what Jesus began to do, and for us to infer that what he means to tell us in Acts is that this is what Jesus continued to do. Luke and Acts are unfortunately separated in our Bibles by the Gospel of John. Remember, the order is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then Acts. Wouldn't it have been better, I think, but I wasn't in charge of making this up, if it were maybe John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and then we would have clearly been able to see and read Luke and then Acts and not view them as two separate entities. In fact, scholars now, when they write about Luke's writings, they refer to the two volumes as one work, and they call it Luke Acts. As Luke begins writing Acts, it's clear that he wants us to read Acts as volume 2, not just of his own writing, but as volume 2 of Jesus' ministry. Luke wants us to see that what the church did as recorded in Acts, the church implementing their mission, is actually the story of what Jesus did through them, him implementing his mission through them and now through us. Luke does this both in his gospel and in Acts by pointing us towards what for him is the key event in Jesus' ministry, the ascension. And that may surprise you. For Luke, the ascension is the turning point. It's the key point in Jesus' ministry. It's not the cross is crucial and essential. The empty tomb is crucial and essential. But Luke closes his gospel and opens the book of Acts by describing the ascension of Jesus. Every good story has its turning point, a pivot on which the story hangs, like a well-balanced door on its hinges. For Luke, in his two books, his turning point is the ascension. Not the birth of Christ, not the cross of Christ, not even the empty tomb of Christ. Luke's pivot point is the ascension of Christ. And we see this if we look back in Luke chapter 9. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus is finishing his ministry up in the north in Galilee. He's about to head to Jerusalem, where he would face stiff opposition. He would suffer and die there in that holy city, and then he would rise from the grave and conquer death. And in Luke 9:51, we are presented with a turning point in Luke's gospel in the life of Jesus. Luke wants to show us that Jesus' popular Galilean ministry is drawing to an end. And he wants to portray Jesus' determination to see his mission through to the end. So Luke uses in this verse very vivid language. Literally, Luke writes in Luke 9:51 that Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. And you can picture that, can't you? You can picture Jesus in your mind's eye turning and looking towards the Jerusalem and saying, okay, now friends, now we're going to go to the holy city. But it's Luke's comment at that point that clues us in as to just how important the ascension is to Luke. Because what you'd expect if Luke's going to comment on why Jesus is going to Jerusalem, you would expect him to write, he's going to Jerusalem because the time for him to die or the time for him to be resurrected was coming. But what does Luke say in 9:51? As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Luke sees Jesus going to Jerusalem. Yes, it's going to the cross. Yes, it's moving towards the resurrection, but ultimately moving towards his ascension when he would be lifted up and exalted and installed as reigning king of all creation. And so this ascension is a turning point. It's a pivot point in the Jesus story. Part 1 is everything Jesus said and did before he was taken up. Part 2, the book of Acts, is everything he said and did through his disciples by the power of the Holy Spirit after he was taken up. In part 1, Jesus is physically present on earth, preaching the word, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons. In part 2, Jesus continues this kind of ministry, but from a different position. He suffered, he died, he rose, and now he's ascended, exalted to the very throne of God. When we read John's Revelation, we see a vision of Jesus. He's a slain lamb standing in the middle of the throne of God. His suffering is a reality, his resurrection is a reality, and his exaltation is a reality. He's the one who suffered, the one who died, the one who rose, and the one who's now at the very throne of God. And from his throne then, Pentecost is possible. From his throne, from his ascended position, he can then with the Father pour out his presence, pour out his Spirit. So literally he can be everywhere. In part one, he can only be at one place and one time. He's limited by his physical presence. But in part two, the part that we're in, he can be everywhere, living and acting and witnessing through his disciples by the power of the Spirit. What Luke does for us here in chapter 1 is to give us a window into what the rest of the book of Acts is all about by describing what happened during the 40-day intermission, that period between resurrection and ascension. Jesus uses this 40-day intermission to tell his disciples just how he will be living his life through them. He's commissioning them not to do their own thing as they feel led. And I hope you see the implications for us here. Not to do their own thing as they feel led, but rather to follow him, to open up their lives to Jesus so he can live through them and continue to save the world. This has profound implications for us. Jesus is wanting us to do the same thing, not to do our own thing and ask him to bless it, but to open up our lives to his presence, his power, his leading and direction, so we can simply say, "What's next, Lord?" If you read the Holy Spirit, it's a whole lot of, "What's next, Lord?" It seemed right to them. The Spirit was leading them. It's that kind of a language that truly in the book of Acts, and hopefully today, we can have the Spirit-led church. As Luke tells the story, he spends 40 days with his friends, commissioning them to do the things that he himself had done, then commending them to wait for the power they would need to carry out the mission. What we see first of all is the power of the mission. The mission is empowered by God's Spirit. Jesus says, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses." He spends 40 days with his friends. He's seeking, I think, as we read this, I think we can see that Jesus is seeking to build a dependence on him, a sense that his being alive is normal, that when they saw him in those first couple of days, it wasn't a dream, it wasn't something fleeting, it wasn't something that was going to go away, but that his life was real. I think that's why God let him stay there for 40 days, to get the disciples used to the reality that he was alive. And so Jesus wouldn't be for them a distant memory, but would be a real presence. But then the perplexing thing is Jesus is indicating that he's going to leave them, and then he does leave them. So on the one hand, he's trying to convince them of the reality of his presence and of his resurrection and of his life, but on the other hand, he goes and leaves them. What's up with that? Think of how Lady Diana's friends must have felt when, remember that? Was it 1981 or so? When she married Prince Charles. I'm sure her friends, and she grew up in humble circumstances, I'm sure she was, I think, a preschool teacher. I'm sure they were excited to be sure that their friend had become a princess, but I'm sure they had a bit of sadness also, for they knew they'd see a lot less of her once she moved into the palace. Jesus was telling his friends, and he knew that his friends would long for him once he left them, but at the same time, he made them a promise that I'm leaving you physically, but I'm not going to leave you spiritually. Wait, and I'll come back to you. Wait for power from on high. And we wonder, well, what kind of power? And what would they do with that power? And maybe some of them